Hey guys, this is OMG Clado, and this is the second part of my series, the top 0.56% for Deuces Cracked. So today I'm just going to go over a hand history that I played actually quite a while ago now. It was a $36 buy-in, so that's, obviously the equivalent of a $35 buy-in now. And perhaps some of you who don't already play the 35s will now maybe get the chance to see maybe some of the players at this level, so you get to compare the levels. As I mentioned in my prelude, I think in general, they're still very beatable, and whilst there's obviously more regs, including some regs who don't actually play the lower levels, they're still very beatable, like I said, and there's a ton of fish, and you'll kind of probably see some of, the kind of things that they do within this hand history. So I just want to point out a few things first. At any point, if I make any statements or go over a hand in some way that you disagree with or whatever, feel free to comment. I'm not perfect, and sometimes I will make some mistakes, and I give good ranges in general, but of course they're not going to be perfect sometimes, and again, if you disagree, feel free to mention it. I am a coach, but coaches make mistakes too, and I think it's definitely actually a good thing if you question them. So yeah, feel free to do that, and of course ask any questions in general as well. So anyway, yeah, we'll just get straight into it. Again, I'm just gonna basically anything that's a trivial fold, such as this hand, I'm basically just gonna straight away go past it. Again, if you disagree or want to question anything, feel free to do so. So yeah, and probably in the next series, I'm actually gonna specifically go over opening ranges. So I know maybe some of you would have preferred me to do that in the first episode already, but for this video, I'm just basically gonna go through this hand history and explain the hands within this hand history. And again, I will at some point go over individually, what kind of opening ranges we should be having in general. But anyway, I'm just gonna go straight into it, like I said. So so far already some pretty easy folds. This is a pretty hand, of course, but again, it's too loose to open here, so it's a fold. Yeah, I'm just gonna see what happens. Obviously once people raise, it's a fold. Yeah. The only reason I even bothered to go to the next steps was just in case someone, for example, it was a limp pot or something, because sometimes that does happen and it can be kind of confusing what to do, especially when we flop top pair or something like that. So anyway, here this is a pretty standard open on the button. Yeah, not much else to say. Usually, I like to open to 3x up at every level up until and including 2550. Sometimes at 2550 I might open to a little bit smaller, on the cutoff in the button, like maybe 125, which is 2.5x, but other than that, I usually just open to 3x. Something that a lot of players, or a few players have done anyway, that I think you can definitely consider doing is at 1020 and also 1530, but especially 1020, since our ranges are basically going to be almost exclusively for value, it's actually something that you can consider to do to open your entire range to 4x at every position. So that's to say, at the first hand, if you're under the gun, anything you open under the gun, you can open to 80 instead of 60, which is again 4x instead of 3x. Again, this is just because our opening range is almost exclusively for value, and it's literally exclusively to for value until we get to maybe the cutoff or something like that, where we can start opening some hands like Queen Jack offsuit or something like that. And yeah, because it's for value, and fish will be calling regardless of our raise size, especially they don't really mind calling 80 instead of 60, and it's not really going to change the calling range, so we may as well make the pot as big as possible when we have premiums and so on. So yeah, I mean, that's just something you can consider. Again, it's not something that I currently do, but it's something that if I once I get more once I start playing a lot of games again, yeah, I probably will actually consider doing that myself. So again, it's just something to consider. Anyway, they both fold. So now there's a limper. I think it's pretty standard, and most of you probably already know about this, but whenever there's a limper, usually when you have a hand that you're going to raise, usually just make it roughly one big blind or a little bit less for every limper. So in this case, I normally open to 90, so I open to 120 here, I believe. Yep. And yeah, not much else to say, and he calls. So on this flop, when we're in position, I generally just prefer to check back, simply because this flop is actually one of the best flops, basically. Well, maybe not one the best, because there are still some connected cards and there's a flush draw, but it's basically one of the better flops, or one of the best flops anyway. The continuation bet as a bluff. So for example, in this case, if I had isolated him, with this player with for example, I don't know, ace jack or something, and obviously I missed the flop, it would be a good board to just bet and take it down, because it basically doesn't really hit much of his range at all. And also usually only weaker players will be limp calling, usually. So when they do that, it basically means that they will have a thought process which basically constitutes to putting us on ace king because we raised. And yeah, I don't know, usually king high and ace high boards are really good to basically usually c-bet when we didn't actually hit, just because they'll fold very often on them. Obviously it does depend on the other two cards as well, but this is a pretty dry board. So yeah, that being said, it does mean that he's like an average player is typically going to fold most of their hands on this kind of board, and we can still get like one street at least later on. So it's better to check behind here and call a bet, or bet the turn or the river, rather than to bet ourselves here. Obviously flush draws will be calling, and as will pocket eights, tens, nines or whatever if he plays them like that, and as well as maybe a 7 or 5 or whatever, depending on how bad he is. But in any case, with like with jacks or queens or whatever here, basically a hand that we can probably only aim to get one street or maybe two maximum, it's better to check back here, usually. And whereas, if we had something like, for example, ace king, I would say it's a must bet, because we can definitely aim to get 3 streets versus weaker players with basically top pair plus. And similarly at the same time, you do want to be careful that versus regulars, you don't really necessarily plan to get 3 streets with something like ace king or just the top pair, because if they're good or decent, they shouldn't really be paying you off with worse. In general, of course. In I don't know, deep stack cash games, or like even MTTs or something with history or whatever. Obviously that does happen sometimes, but in general, in these games, the rigs usually will play ABC, and I think that's correct actually. In general, there's not really any need to get fancy and stuff. So yeah, like that's just like something to keep in mind. So basically what I'm saying is just like a side note, just don't really just be careful not really to overplay your overpairs or top pairs versus rigs or something. Like for example, versus probably like 90% of regulars, like if the blinds are like 10-20 and you open like aces under the gun, and one of them say for example, yeah, flats in the blinds, and the flop is, for example, king 7-2 rainbow, and the regular checks, and then you c-bet with your aces as you should, and he check raises you, versus probably like 90% of regulars, and maybe even more. This is just a snap fold. They're almost never doing it for with worse. And on this particular board, maybe occasionally some of them will be playing ace king like this, but it's pretty bad too in general. And usually again versus almost all of the regulars, this is basically going to be a set like every time. Especially at these blind levels, people are just not playing back, and they shouldn't be either. In general, like obviously in terms of balance and stuff, they should have bluffs in their range, but it just doesn't really happen. So that's just something to keep in mind. Anyway, so onto the hand, we check behind. This is actually obviously like a pretty bad turn card for us. Yeah, and once he basically pots it, it becomes a pretty easy fold. If he bets like really small, like maybe 1/3 of the pot or something, I'll probably call one straight and fold the river. But other than that, it becomes a really easy fold. And yeah, I mean, if instead the turn had come, for example, a blank like a 2 of clubs or whatever, and he bet the same size, I'd probably still somewhat be inclined to fold, just because without any reads, there's not really any reason for us to think that he's going to be making such a big raise, such a big bet with anything but a strong hand. Because usually, generally speaking, when weak players make a really big bet, in other words, maybe like pot size or so, it's usually a pretty strong hand. And whilst if he bets smaller or whatever, I'd be happy to call, because it can be a flush draw, or it can be basically any 2 cards once we check the turn. The flop. Once they bet pretty big, on average, again, redless, it's usually going to be a pretty strong hand on average. So again, I'd fold. So yeah, it's a pretty easy fold as played. Here you can open if you want to. It's not really a mistake to or whatever, but in general, and this is something I'll probably go into a bit more detail later on, but in general I do lean towards the slightly tighter approach, and that's just because I play a lot of tables. Like usually I'm playing 30 plus or something like that. So that's something that you guys can consider as well. Like when you are aiming to play more tables to maximize your hourly, you do want to basically avoid marginal situations or something. Like for example, if I'm playing like 2 tables, I think that opening this hand in this particular situation would probably be very, very slightly profitable. And when I say profitable, it's obviously because they'll fold enough so that I win the blinds enough, and I also know what kind of boards to c-bet when the blinds flat call or whatever, and obviously I can they'll check fold sometimes and stuff. So again, that's if I'm playing like 2 tables, 4 tables, or basically very little tables, and I can think about these things and factor in their HUD stats when I'm making the decision whether to c-bet or not. On the contrary, if I'm playing 30 tables plus, you know, if I have to make all of these decisions, I don't really have enough time to you know, consider all of these factors that seriously. So in any case, if I'm playing that many tables, it's probably going to be, you know, slightly you know, minus EV to open this now, because not only am I not going to be able to think about these things as much as I would be able to if I'm playing less tables, it's also going to basically give me less time for my other decisions. So hope that makes sense. So for example, if I would normally open, like, say if I'm playing, you know, 4 tables or something, if I normally open like ace 10 plus here, maybe if I'm playing 30 tables here, I'd open ace queen plus or something, for example. Or in this actual situation, maybe I usually open something like ace 10 offsuit plus, in which case, you know, now you know, I would be opening tighter. Sorry, ace 10 offsuit is what I would probably be opening here if I'm, you know, playing my, you know, cap tables, and, you know, therefore I would be folding ace 9 offsuit. But, you know, if I were playing less tables, then, you know, this would be the bottom of my range. In any case, you know, I did decide to fold this time. Here again, well, not really again. I was gonna say it's a similar situation, but it's really not. You know, even if I was playing 2 tables, I would be folding this. So ignore what I just said. Anyway, once he raises, it's a pretty easy fold. Okay, so again, easy folds. We get a walk, which is always nice. Here, basically, the only reason I decided to pause here is just because this is a pretty easy fold. But that being said, because it's a multi-way pot and there's, you know, already three people in, and the big blind is going to call much wider than he normally would because, you know, of how many players there are already, I would generally be inclined to call here with any like suited connector hand. Normally with these kind of stack sizes, and especially out of position, it's not really going to be a great idea to call something like 8-7 suited here, especially if the other 2 people who flat called had folded. But in this case, because, you know, it's a multi-way pot, you know, it would be pretty standard here in general to call, you know, 5-6 suited plus or something like that, or maybe even 4-5 suited, and you know, any pocket pair, of course. But, you know, queen jack off, I'm just dumping it just because, you know, under the gun raises and stuff, and we're almost never going to get it in good and stuff. And when we do flop top here, it's going to be dominated a lot, and yeah, it's just a bad idea to call here in general. Again, if it was suited, I'd definitely go for it though. So yeah. Okay, so ace king, standard raise on the button, and we get a call. Here, so this is a pretty good example of a situation where we do versus the average opponent basically want to bet, and, you know, when I say bet, I mean like bet the flop, turn, and river to get in the stacks by the river. Especially versus weaker players, you know, in this particular situation, I don't actually recognize the username. I'm not saying he is, you know, a weaker player or he's a regular, but you know, again, versus the average player or whatever, I do basically intend to stack off here just because on average, you know, on average, the average opponent is basically gonna stack off here with many worse hands, especially any king. But sometimes the weakest players will also basically just go broke with, like, you know, a queen, a 4, or something like that. So in any case, you kind of want to like think about what kind of bet sizing you're making, what kind of bet sizes you're making. So like a lot of players, and I would say even most players, especially who play players who play sitting goes, tend to make the mistake of, you know, betting the flop, then betting the turn, and then realizing, oops, I've only got, you know, like a 10%, I don't know, pot size bet now. So, you know, it's kind of silly to do that. And if that's the situation, you really want to like be betting, like, if that was the exact situation, you should have bet probably smaller on the flop and the turn, so you can maybe like shove the river for at least maybe say like 40% or probably more. And the other reason for that is because if you bet small on the flop and the turn, you can still get it all in by the river, but you know, if you did bet smaller, they're going to call off a wider range. So in this case, for example, you know, if I bet like 300 now, he might fold a queen, but if I bet like, you know, 150, he's probably going to call a queen. And almost all recreational or weaker players will be calling a queen here if I bet, you know, 150, and some of them will fold to 300. You know, of course, some of them will still call 300, but you get the idea. And in any case, during this actual hand history, I don't actually know if I was thinking about these things that well, to be honest. So we'll see about the sizing. But you know, in any case, I think, yeah, 225 is a little bit on the bigger side, but it's probably okay. I would probably say like 150 or so is probably one of the better sizing yeah, to make, because on this particular board, there's not really much that we're worried about and stuff. Like, for example, if we had like ace jack and the board was, you know, jack 10-2 with a flush draw, that's a board where we can bet a bit bigger, because there's gonna be, you know, a queen or a king, which are both overcards, which aren't really good for which aren't really turns we want to see. And not only are they bad for our hand because he can have a queen or a king, but it's also bad in the sense that you know, if he has, like, you know, for example, Jack 7 suited or something, these cards are going to be scare cards for him as well, and we're going to basically get paid less often as well, because it's going to be a scared card for him. So again, in situations where there's a flush draw, we're not only worried when we see the flush card because he could have, sorry, like, the third flush card come because he could have a flush, but it's also because he can also think that we have it if he doesn't, and therefore he's going to pay us off less. So again, if he does have like, on this particular board, let's say the king was, okay, well, we have the king of hearts. Let's say the queen was the queen of hearts, right? If the turn came, like say a three of hearts or something, if he's got, like, for example, queen jack now, unless he's really really loose, he's usually gonna fold now, because not only can we have a king, but now we can also have a flush, and that's just an example. So anyway, basically on flops where it's likely that the turn is gonna bring scare cards, we can bet a bit more on the flop and the turn, instead, whereas on dry boards, we can bet a bit less to get in stacks by the river. So again, this isn't even like a really dry board, because obviously there's straight draws he can have and stuff. But for example, if the board was like king 2-2, and we have ace king, for example, we really can bet really small on the flop and the turn. Obviously don't make the mistake of betting so small that you can't even get the stacks in by the river, but bet on the smaller side, because not only is his calling range lesser, but there's also a lot less, I don't know, I guess bad cards for us. In any case, this is the bet size I decided to choose, and he did fold. So next hand, this is definitely a fold no matter who folds to us. Same here. Here, it's a pretty, generally, yeah, it's a pretty standard fold. Pre-ante, like, this is just something I'm going to bring up now. Obviously, I'll go into detail more later, but pre-ante, our ranges are going to be much, much tighter than, once there are antes. And the reason for this, simply put, is basically because there's so much more dead money once there are antes, and therefore, in any spot where we shove, we're going to have more fold equity. So that's to say, when everyone folds, we pick up more dead money. And not only that, but when they do call, there's also going to be, again, more dead money. And this gives us, like, slightly better pot odds. So for example, if I go all in for 1,000, and the blinds are 50-100, and they all fold, I win 150, right? And if let's say the big blind calls, then there's going to be 2,050 in the pot, right? Whereas, if there are antes, obviously this is just a made up example, but let's just say there are antes in the same hand that I just said. So we'll say, like, roughly, again, the blinds are 50-100, and we'll just say the antes are 10, so there's going to be roughly 250 in dead money. If I shove now, and everyone folds, I win 250, right? So that's the first thing. I win 250 instead of 150, and that's a really big difference. At the same time, if the big blind calls now, the pot is now going to be like 100 more than it was before, so 2,150, right? So whilst I have the same equity, so this is assuming that his range doesn't change. Regulars' ranges will change, as they should, but like probably 90% of recreational players' ranges don't change once there are antes, simply just because they don't really understand things such as pot odds and so on. So yeah, again, let's say we have 50% versus his calling range with like a particular hand. I don't know, just this is an example only, of course, but let's say we have pocket eights and we go all in, and versus like the big blind's calling range that we estimate, we think we have 50% equity, right? So if he does call and the pot is 2,050, on average we're going to expect to get 1,025 chips from that pot. Whereas if there were antes and there's 2,250, instead, on average we're going to get 1,125. So again, you can see there's a pretty big difference. In any case, this particular hand, I think it's a fold, basically just because there's so many players behind us. Limping is bad for a few reasons. Basically, we don't really have, the odds to hit a set, and because we're not going to get paid off all the time and so on. And also, more importantly, or just as important anyway, there's a lot of players behind us with pretty decent shoving stacks. So King Suck Out, D Lord, and Bondless 9, and probably the small blind also, especially. And when we do limp, they're gonna often be able to just shove with a like a, maybe not even that wide of a range, but they will shove often enough to the point where, and obviously when they shove we have to fold to the point where limping is basically bad. In this particular hand, I think I shoved. Okay, so yeah, this is a mistake. I would say, like, at a guess, again, my ranges maybe aren't perfect or something like that, but I would be pretty confident in saying pocket nines plus and ace queen, ace jack suited or something like that. Maybe a teeny bit wider, like eights plus, ace 10 suited, ace jack off or something, but I would say ace queen offsuit, ace jack suited, and pocket nines plus is approximately right. I don't really think that I don't really think that anyone should have a limping range here. unless maybe for example, if you like, this is one of the notes that I don't really have very often, but if you happen to have a note on one of the players behind that they really like to, shove on top of limpers or something like that, then obviously you can maybe limp aces and kings or something like that to induce, but in general you shouldn't really have a limping range here. And again, my estimated shoving range here I would say is probably pocket nines plus, ace queen offsuit plus, and ace jack suited. Again, if there were antes, it would change greatly. And again, it's important to pay attention to our stack size here. We have 1,565. So if we instead had like maybe say 1,000, then my range would be quite wider, and I would say even sixes would be a shove here just because of the dead money. That being said, it's really important to pay attention to the stats of the limper. So for example, if his stats are like say 10-9 over the last like 30 hands, which isn't really a big sample, but it's big enough to say that it's pretty likely that he's going to be limping like aces, kings, those two hands in particular, and trapping. So I would be shoving tighter versus this kind of play. Whereas if his stats were instead like typical kind of stats you see like 50/5 or 50/20, 50/25 or whatever, 70/3, whatever, like these kind of really loose stats, then I'm going to be inclined to shove a bit wider because he's limping so much more crap. So yeah, and also again, this is something I'll probably go more into detail later, but you should be taking notes on these kind of guys when they limp. If he limps and then someone shoves and he folds, even if you weren't the one to shove, you should take a note that something along the lines of limp / folded at T100, or big blind, or BB100, which is easier to type, which represents the fact that he he limped, then he folded to a shove, when the big blind was 100, and you should probably take a note about his actual stack size as well. So in other words, you might want to take a note that he limp / folded at T100 with a 10 BB stack or something like that. Yeah, again, so these kind of reads are really important, and obviously, like if you take a note on someone that they limp and folded, and in another game you have a situation where you have a hand that it's kind of in the middle, kind of between your shoving range and your folding range. If he has limp and folded before, then you can you can shove it basically, because it's right on the fence. So therefore, if you have a piece of information that makes you lean towards a shove, then of course go for it. Whereas if instead you had a note that he like say limped like ace 10 under the gun and then called a shove, then you should obviously be less inclined to shove something on the border, because you're going to have less fold equity, and he's also limping something like ace 10, which he's going to call. So for example, if I were on the button and I had ace 9, that's something I would usually shove on top of a limp with like a for example like a 1200 stack size or something. But if I did have a note that he limp called like ace 10, then I'd probably fold ace 9, for example. Not because specifically ace 10 is better than ace 9 and I think he always limps ace 10 exactly, but it means that ace 9 is kind of borderline in the sense that if he does limp and call with hands like ace jack plus or something like that, that they dominate us, then again, it does mean it's more likely that he's going to be calling. And when we do shove, the main reason we're shoving with these kind of hands is for fold equity. Obviously, if we're shoving, say for example, ace king, or aces, or queens, kings, jacks, or whatever, it's more for value, because when he does call, he'll call with much worse hands. But when we shove with like pocket sixes, or ace 9, ace 8, or whatever, these hands are hands that we're shoving because of the fold equity, not for value. We don't really expect to get called by worse very often. That being said, a lot of these players will actually limp and call with like all sorts of crap, and sometimes you shove ace 2 offsuit because of the fold equity you have, and then sometimes he calls with queen jack, or you shove with king queen and he calls with like queen 7 suited or queen 8 suited or whatever. Again, I did say that this is actually a fold, but let's see what happens. Okay, so we get a call and he calls. Okay, so immediately I can say two things. One, you can see the kind of the crap that they limp call with, and I guess the button calls the shove, which is really really bad as well. So what I would do is I would take a note on the button that he calls shoves very widely and bad or something, and I would maybe color code him like a fish, like maybe green, which is like that's the color I would usually use, for example, but you can obviously use your own system. And the same with the under the gun guy. Definitely take a note that he limp / called with queen 7 suited under the gun for 10 BBs at T100 or something like that, something along the lines of that. Basically, just make sure you take a note to the point where the next time he does limp, you know what kind of hands he's limping with. So yeah, I mean we did well, not hold, but we did win this 3-way all in. But yeah, again, you do see the kind of crap that does happen sometimes. So yeah. Anyway, here, okay, so Once the blinds are like bigger, I generally raise a bit less, unless there's a lot of players with a deepish stack. So when I say deepish, I mean like maybe, for example, if everyone at the table had like 25 big blinds or something like that, or more, or most people had like 3,000 or more, something like that, I might still open three times, especially in early position. But usually, something like 2.75 or 2.5 or even 2.25 in later positions is fine. This is obviously like a preference thing mostly, but definitely for sure, once the blinds are bigger, you should be opening like a slightly smaller raise size in terms of the number of big blinds. The reason for this is basically just because whilst you're opening a less number of big blinds, you're threatening a bigger percentage of your opponent's effective stack sizes. So this is pretty important. So yeah, in any case, Ace King is obviously a clear open under the gun. Usually with these stack sizes and these blind levels, I would probably be opening something like Ace Queen, Ace Jack suited, and like pocket eights or so. I know obviously a lot of regulars will be opening different to that. Some of them might, for example, fold eights. Some of them will open wider, like I don't know, a lot of suited broadways and stuff like that, and that's fine as well. But again, I do lean towards a tighter approach just because I'm playing so many tables, and if it's really marginal, I probably just don't bother. That being said, if there are a lot of weak players on the table, and you can obviously identify that by like their HUD stats as well as if you recognize them and stuff, it does become pretty good to open like a bit wider, like for example even like Ace 10 offsuit or especially Ace Jack offsuit, because not only will they be calling a lot of hands that we dominate, like especially weaker players love hands like basically any ace or King Jack, Queen Jack, 10 Jack, whatever, any of these hands that they shouldn't be flat calling with. They will, so we can get value from Ace Jack. But not only that, they'll also very often like flat call and then check fold the flop, or if they're in position, just fold to a c-bet and stuff like that. So and that's as opposed to shoving, which they should usually be doing with most of these stack sizes. So that's a reason why you can open a bit wider. But again, in this particular situation, readless on any of the players, I would personally be opening like Ace Queen offsuit, Ace Jack suited, and pocket eights plus also. And obviously whether I call a shove or not depends on the player, their stats, and their stack size. So in any case, I open, which is very standard with this hand. And on this particular board, there's a few things you can do. Like c-betting is fine. Checking behind is also fine. Just because yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on his reads and stuff. But that being said, this is just something to keep in mind. But it's not really something I would recommend for the 180s, just because you should generally play quite straightforward. But you can c-bet this flop with the intention of also betting any club turn, and as well as some overcards as well. In other words, either scare cards for him, which he's likely to fold to second barrel on, or cards that basically give us more equity. So again, obviously, like any club will give us like the nut flush draw and stuff. So in this case, I did bet and he folded. Again, not betting this board is okay. But I would usually bet it versus most people. That being said, like for example, if the 8 were like a 6 instead, I would be a bit less inclined to bet, and also especially if it were like a spade instead of a club, because we wouldn't have as good of a barreling, as good of a number of cards that we can barrel the turn with. Because I mean we'll have the king high flush draw instead, but that won't be as strong. And again, if it were a 6 instead, these kind of boards, like 3 really lowish connected cards, these kind of boards generally versus most people have a pretty low c-bet success rate, and that's just because, I mean, obviously it depends on if he's a reg or recreational player, but if he's a reg, it will work more often or something usually. But versus recreational players, like their calling range has a lot of like random middle connected cards because they like their Nuno Grano or something, or and not only that, but they'll also have like a lot of pocket pairs that they're not folding. And also, this is actually something that's quite important, and I'm sure you guys would have seen this, but recreational players very often, especially the very very weak and loose ones, on such boards they'll call like with any 2 overcards, just because I don't know, they in their mind you can't have anything, and they think that if they do hit the overcard they'll be good like almost always or something. So very often on like a 6-5-3 with a flush draw board, even if they're out of position, sometimes like Fish will just call with King Queen, just because they think that their King High can be good or something, because you're on such a board you don't really hit it very often or whatever, and more importantly they think that they have King and Queen as outs and so on. So anyway, I did see bet, and like I said, I did win. Here it's obviously an easy fold. Here Yeah, okay, so here's like a general thing that I'm gonna point out. Like blind versus blind, for 10 big blinds or less versus almost anyone. And when I say almost anyone, I basically mean non-regulars and also like fish who aren't too loose. Like I'm not saying this big blind is a fish because I don't really remember his name or whatever, but I'm just saying like versus almost anyone. And again, anyone is basically like a non-regular who's also not too loose. You can shove any two cards for 10 big blinds or less. Um, I'll go through like the specific math in a later session, and the people who I've already coached would have already seen this math, and it's not actually like essential or whatever. It's just something that will help your understanding. But basically, it does work out to be profitable, unless they're calling some like with 10 big blinds exactly. If you're shoving 3-2 offsuit, um, they have to be calling around 26% or wider for that to be not profitable. And I'll show you quickly on PokerStove here, but basically the average random is never calling that wide. Like if we say 26, like it might be a little bit less. We'll say 25%. But if you look at 25%, sometimes they call any ace and maybe any pocket pair like at widest, but they're not like that. Like again, we're talking about randoms here. We're not talking about regulars. Randoms on average aren't even calling every ace and every pocket pair, but like even if they are, they're definitely not calling like all of this stuff like on average, right? Then King 10 suited usually they don't call, like even King Jack suited is kind of borderline. King Jack offsuit I think again is borderline, but even this, which I think is much too wide for most randoms, it's like 23% or whatever. So you can see that even with 3-2 offsuit, it becomes profitable to shove any two cards with 10 big blinds or less. Now, when we shove with 3-2 offsuit, there's a few things that are important to note here. Firstly, this is like one of the hands with like one of the worst equities, out of all of the hands. So if we make this hand better, at like by any, so I'll just quickly show you what I mean. Like 3-2 offsuit has a specific equity versus that range, right? Now, the calculation will be basically entirely based off this. So this will be familiar in a later session series, but sorry episode. But we have like roughly 28% of 3-2 offsuit, right? Now if we make our hand a little bit better, right, and we make it 6-5 offsuit, it's gonna it's gonna have a little bit better equity, or even a lot better equity. Now if you consider that, it's like the variables to consider whether we should shove when we're blind versus blind are basically two things. Many things actually, sorry, but the main thing is one, the main things, sorry, are our hand, our stack sizes, and obviously our opponent. Now, our opponent, when I say what I mean by that is basically his calling range. As well as that, you can also consider your table image and stuff like that, but that basically just determines our opponent's calling range. So for example, if we shove the last 10 hands in a row, his calling range might be like 30% if it were normally 20%, just because he thinks we're so wide, and he's going to call a bit wider than he normally does. But in anyway, what I want to like mention about this is the fact that like let's say as a default, I'm saying to shove any two cards with 10 big blinds versus basically non-regulars and fish who are other players who aren't like particularly loose, because even if he's not a regular and he's playing like 60-30, I'm not going to shove 2-3 offsuit for obvious reasons, right? But again, versus these particular players, if that's my default, then let's think about it this way. The variables which can change are the player, our stack sizes, and our hand, right? So let's say he suddenly become like something like shifts away from our decision to shove, right? So let's say like there's a few things. The first thing is obviously our hand can change. So if it becomes better, like instead of 2-3 offsuit, we have 6-5 offsuit, which has better equity, as I just showed you. That's something that favors us towards shoving, right? Our hand becomes better. Or obviously similarly, if it becomes worse, then it's something that favors us against shoving. So if we like obviously with 2-3 offsuit, it doesn't really get much worse, but like let's say for example my default instead was to shove like in a particular situation, maybe for example 15 big blinds, let's say, again this is an example only, but let's say 15 big blinds, my default is to shove like say top 50%, right? Now let's again, this is like completely an example, but let's say on the 50th percentile, 10-7 off doesn't cut it, right? So if anything shifts towards us like if any factor changes shifts towards us shoving, then I would now shove 10-7 offsuit. So that's to say, for example, like versus like the average opponent, I would shove 50%. Let's say this opponent suddenly I noticed that his stats are really tight. So instead, maybe I would adjust and I'd shove 55% now, because he's tighter than the average opponent. So therefore he's gonna fold more often, and I'm gonna have more fold equity. So that's why I would shove a bit wider now. If I noticed that this particular player was quite tight. Similarly, if instead I realize that this particular player is very loose, like he's playing 50-30 or something, now I might shove like 40%. Again, you see like how these things can affect our decisions. And again, like there's no like specific exact number that we have to have in our minds, but it comes with experience. Like the more you play, the more you'll understand like how to adjust our ranges accordingly towards these different factors, right? Like I don't know exactly how much I should change my range if the player is a little bit loose or something, but I have a pretty damn good idea. So, and again, this is something that I think all of you should have no problem doing after basically again practice and experience. Like just play a lot of these games. Like when these spots come up, just think about it. Think what variables we need to consider, and think how these variables affect our ranges. Like have a default range in mind, which is pretty important, but then also like learn how to like change these ranges. So again, that's that was an example I gave. And now our actual hand, right? Well, our actual hand is in the range, so that's irrelevant. But anyway, stack size also, right? Like whenever, like in any particular situation, whenever we shove, right, we have a particular range that we should be shoving. So again, let's say for example it's 50%, right? The bottom of this range is always going to be profitable because of fold equity. Obviously, like versus his calling range, we're not going to be ahead, right? So with the bottom of our range, that is, right? So let's say we have in the top 50%, we have this like range. When I say I shove 50%, obviously I don't mean it exactly like based on poker. So like I'll shove twos way before I shove. Well, okay, maybe not way before, but I don't know. I probably shove twos before I shove jack 7 off, for example. But anyway, let's just say this is the top 50%, right? So when we look at this, the bottom of this range, like for example, king 5 offsuit, right, versus a typical player, a typical player's calling range in any particular situation where I'm shoving, that range. Sorry. Okay, so again, if I'm shoving like king 5 offsuit, right, which I am in top 50% here, it's gonna like versus the average calling range where I'm shoving king 5, that range not gonna be, it's gonna be behind. Sorry. So let's say like blind versus a pretty tight player, he's calling like 12%, random example, right? King 5 is obviously not gonna be ahead of that range. In fact, it's gonna be quite behind. Now, that being said, king 5 is still profitable, and that's because of how often he shoves. Folds. Sorry. So, we have 31% versus his calling range, but because of how often he folds and we pick up the dead money in the pot, it's still profitable. Now, if you think about that, it's actually really important to note the fact that our stack size is really gonna drastically affect like how much we lose when he calls on average. So again, when he calls, we're gonna lose money on average, right? But the deeper he is, the more we're gonna lose on average if we're behind. So let's say like with a bit, like this is actually like almost half of the calculations that I was going to show you, but like let's say with this particular situation, like if we're shoving 10 big blinds, blind versus blind, then sorry, my mistake, I accidentally opened the program. Sorry. Okay, so again, 10 big blinds, blind versus blind. Let's just say he's again with that particular situation, like king 5 offsuit versus his 12% calling range, he's going to have okay, so 69% equity, right? He's gonna have 69% equity, and we're gonna have 31% therefore. So like whenever he does call, assuming we're shoving for 10 big blinds, obviously the pot is gonna be 20 BB when he calls, right? Because this is pre-ante, by the way. So yeah, we shove 10 big blinds, he calls 10 big blinds, the pot is now 20 big blinds. Now out of this 20 big blinds, he's expected to get 69%, or for simplicity we'll say 70%. So again, this is just for simplicity, we'll make the numbers easier to calculate. But out of these 20 big blinds, when he does call, so when we shove king 5 also and he calls with his 12%, on average we're gonna be losing 4 big blinds. And the reason for that is because on average he expects to get 70% of the pot, and the pot is 20 big blinds. Sorry, that's not in there. Okay, so now you can see, like, so 20 big blinds times 0.7 equals 14, and 20 big blinds times 0.3, which is our equity on average versus his range with king 5. it's going to be 6. So therefore, when he calls, on average, we're going to lose 4 big blinds, because we had 10 big blinds to start with. Actually, sorry, no, we had it's actually 3.5 because of the small blind. But anyway, you get the idea. Like when he calls, we're going to be losing, right? But when he folds, we obviously pick up the 1.5 big blinds, and he's going to fold much more often than he calls. Anyway, the point of that is obviously that the deeper he is, the more we're going to lose on average if we're behind again. So hopefully that made sense. And again, I'm going to go through these calculations again in the latest later episode. So if that wasn't like 100% clear, which I hope it is, then it will be later. So again, the point of that is that the deeper we are, or the more big blinds we have, the tighter our range should be. And the reason for that is because, again, that's another variable we have to consider. And if he's deeper, then it means that on average we're going to lose more with a particular weak hand. So again, in this particular situation, I gave, like, let's say 50% as our 50% is our shoving range. With 10 big blinds, sorry, with 15 big blinds, again, that's not actually, the shoving range, but that's an example. If it is 50, then, if instead we have 16 big blinds, maybe it'll become like 47, because we're deeper now, and we're going to lose more with the bottom of our range. Now, instead, if we become, shallower, and it's 14 big blinds instead, maybe we shove like 52 now, until we get to the point where, once we're on 10 big blinds, we're actually shoving 100. Not 5,100, but you get the idea. So in any case, in this particular situation, again, I would shove like any 2 cards versus most people who aren't regulars. And yeah, it's like with 10 big blinds. In this case, we're actually only 13 big blinds deep. So that's one factor that factors towards us shoving, right? And the second factor is like Queen 8 offsuit has much better equity than 3-2 offsuit does, for obvious reasons, right? So this is basically a clear shove, and it's going to be very profitable. Whereas if we were shoving with 3-2 offsuit here, it would still be profitable versus again, non-regulars or non-really loose players, but it wouldn't be as profitable, and it's basically almost close to marginal, really. So yeah, this is a very clear and profitable shove. So yeah. Okay, so pretty easy fold. Okay, so once he makes it like 6 times, yeah, that's a pretty easy fold. Let's say we're readless versus this guy. This is just like something that I like to do sometimes. I'll just say hypothetically, let's say we're in this spot. We shouldn't have any calling range. I mean, like, I guess if you really wanted to, you can call aces and kings here, just to, like, I don't know, somewhat induce or something. But obviously, to any decent player, it'll just look ridiculously obvious that you have aces if they know you're regular or something. So yeah, just don't have any flatting range here. And again, completely readless. My range here to shove. I don't expect to have any fold equity, but my range here, just at a guess, would probably be like either jacks plus or tens plus, and like ace king, maybe ace queen suited, depending on how I feel. But I probably wouldn't be too thrilled to get it in with like ace queen off, for example. So that's just like like a random example of what my range would be there. Oops, sorry. Okay, I guess this wouldn't be like I guess a clear fold, but it is a fold just because we can't profitably shove, and raising would be pretty bad with these stack sizes just because almost everyone has a pretty clear reshoving stack. So yeah, it's a pretty standard fold here, pre-ante anyway. So yeah, again, these pocket pairs, pre-ante, it's not profitable to shove here, and open raising is bad also. So it's a pretty easy fold. Yeah, yeah, there's nothing we can do here. It is interesting though, because we do want to ask ourselves, what would we do here with any particular hand, right? So I don't really think in general we should have a flatting range here, although like some players might, but usually I would just this would be usually a pretty clear spot to basically reshove or fold. In this case, his range is obviously going to be pretty wide. Like, he doesn't expect any fold equity, so it's going to be a little bit like maybe a little bit tighter than it normally would be or something. But with that kind of stack size, he's probably if he's a regular especially gonna be shoving like any pocket pair and like most suited connectors and any Broadway and stuff like that, and probably a little bit wider even just because of the pot odds he's gonna be getting, even if only one person calls or something. So in this particular situation, I would guess, like, again, this is depending on reads and stuff obviously. So for example, if under the gun I had a note that he limps monsters or something, obviously my range will be much tighter. But otherwise, it's probably gonna be something like with these stack sizes, like pocket eights or nines plus, and like ace king and probably ace queen, I guess. Although not too happy about it. And just in case you guys want to see what happened. So like I think Suzy is a regular. And I think his play preflop is it's okay, but it's probably a bit questionable. Like it's basically like once a red glimpse here, it's basically it's almost exactly like jacks and tens kind of hand usually. And I think he should definitely just raise, but as played, obviously it becomes a really standard shove. And the shorty here obviously had basically what we expected. So anyway, yeah, here's pretty easy fold. Like the hand is just so bad. Like we get a good price and stuff, but this is maybe a mistake that some people make. So if you do this currently, definitely fold here. I'd call like for example like queen 9 suited and maybe queen 8 suited or something, but anything under that, just dump it. It's just bad. And call any pocket pair and any suited ace and stuff, and basically like any suited connector of some sort of playability. But yeah, just basically this hand, just dump it because it's not going to be good. Okay, so we have antes now. This is like I guess one of the biggest, most important things for the 180s. Now I want basically all of you to listen really carefully here, because like some of you will already be aware, but a lot of people, especially people who aren't currently like crushing, I guess, the biggest thing that they have a problem with is they don't shove wide enough once antes come. Or if you want me to reword that, they have a much different range. Like the difference in their range between when there are antes and when there aren't antes is like not big enough. Like once there are antes, there's just so much more dead money. Like usually the the dead money is almost double. Well, okay, not exactly, but you can see here like the dead money is normally like 375, right? Now instead with antes it's now 600, so it's I don't know, a little bit under double obviously, but it's much more. So when they do fold, you win a lot more money, dead money. So that's the first, again, and also the fact that when they do call you, there's also more dead money to give you slightly better pot odds. But more importantly, it's the fact that when they do fold, you win all the dead money. So the reason why this is important is because again, we're going to shove much wider, or we should be shoving much wider, and at the same time other regulars are going to be as well, and therefore we need to think about like the fact that they're shoving wider means that we also need to like start reshoving wider and stuff like that. So for example, like in this particular situation, like if this guy's a rig, I'm not saying he is, but if he were a rig, like his range is going to be fairly wide here. Obviously it depends on the rig. Some rigs are kind of nits and stuff, and some rigs aren't really good or whatever. But on average, like a rig is going to be shoving something like, let me have a look. Obviously it depends completely on the rig. But let's see. Okay, with this, okay, so I'll tell you what the average shoving range here would probably be, and then I'll tell you like what I think I would be personally shoving here. Okay, maybe. Let's see. So yeah, maybe on average it would be something like this. Now, when we're in this particular situation, we should actually be shoving a little bit, basically much wider. In his particular situation, like there's also other things to consider, which I'll go into detail later, such as the fact that if the blind's about to go up, we should be shoving a little bit wider. But let's just say, ignoring that, as a default, I would probably be at shoving something like this. And obviously, when I make these videos, you guys will see my ranges, so please don't adjust. Anyway, so, at a guess, something like, let's see, yeah, maybe something like this, like maybe a little bit wider, sometimes, but something like this, basically, as you can see. So the point of that is like, if we're on the button here, like we need to think about what kind of hands like basically are ahead of this range, right? So if this were a rig, in this particular situation, I would probably like at an estimate. Again, the only read is that he's a rig. I would probably isolate something like sixes plus, like ace 8 suited, so basically something like this. Again, it does depend on the rig completely, but something like this. Again, the only read is he's a rig, something like this. Like, and I'm pretty sure most of you at the moment who are watching this probably don't isolate quite wide enough yet. So yeah, I mean, again, and this can change a lot. Like some of the rigs will be shoving way wider there. Like the range I gave, some rigs will be shoving a little bit wider than that, especially if the blind's about to go up. Like some rigs will be shoving any ace there, any suited ace, any offsuit ace as well, any pocket pair, which is obviously standard. And yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I'm not saying that's bad. The range I gave is what I would shove, but other rigs would shove wider, just because one of the key concepts in these games is simply to not lose fold equity. That's really important. So yeah, I mean, again, this is my approximate isolating range. So Queen 10 is obviously not in there, but we do fold. So here, this is not a great example because he's only got like one big blind, but something that you guys need to like consider is the fact that like there's a concept. Well, I mean, it's not really a concept, but it's something that a lot of people don't really do correctly, basically. And whenever like a short stack shoves all in, you guys really need to think about what his range is there, and also isolate quite wide, because his range is going to be extremely wide. Like any good regular under the gun with like 3 big blinds or something, or even more, like even like say up to 5 big blinds, they seriously should be shoving like literally any 2 cards, because it's their last chance at fold equity. Like if they fold and then they get hit by the big blind and the small blind or whatever, who's gonna fold to them when they shove 2 big blinds? The answer is some fish, but the point is they shouldn't have any fold equity, and therefore if you shove under the gun with 5 big blinds, sometimes they will all fold, and that's great. You like double your stack almost. So yeah, if for example like under the gun shoves for 5 big blinds, you guys need to think about like what kind of range you should isolate. Like for example, in this exact spot, let's say this guy had like shuffle 1000 instead, and on this exact spot we should be like isolating something like, basically our isolation range should be a little bit narrower, so like slightly less than what we would have shoved if it folded around to us. And the reason for that is obviously because we don't actually get, like we never win the dead money without a showdown now, because we always go to showdown with like the short stack who shoved. But similarly, yeah, so therefore the bottom of our range no longer becomes profitable because of the fact that we always go to showdown with him. But our range can still be quite wide. So again, if he shoved for like five or 4 big blinds and he was a regular, again, the only read is he's a regular, I would be shoving something like, basically, I don't know, it's pretty damn wide, like something like this or some also. And obviously, like, yeah, the reason is just because he should be shoving extremely wide. Any 2 cards for many regulars, but at least like say 50% or something, and all of this will be very profitable because of the fact that not only like are most of these hands ahead of his range, but the fact that there's also dead money to give us good pot odds is basically the reason. And I would basically call this concept, or whatever you want to if you want to consider a concept, isolating for pot odds, and that's something you guys need to basically do. So yeah, like at any time, if you guys want to like maybe post an example of a hand where that's relevant, maybe post it in this video thread, and I'll be happy to tell you like a rough range or whatever, because it's something that isn't that easy to explain, but it's it's definitely something. Again, you learn this mostly through practice, and the more games you play, the better you will be at estimating ranges. So yep, this is obviously like a clear shove, and you can see like this might not even, okay, well, sorry, this is 1 big blind, never mind, he should, yeah. Okay, so yeah, this is a fold. But yeah, I mean, like one of the things that you can consider when you're deciding with like what kind of shoving ranges you should have is in the 180s, in any MTT, including the 180s, once there are antes, instead of looking at our stack size in terms of the number of big blinds, instead we can like do we can instead use like what's called like M under Harrington, or like I think everyone calls it CSI, and that's basically like rounds of rounds of play. And that's, yeah, basically imagine that we folded every single hand and we never went to showdown. So we folded every single hand, and even once we get to 1 big blind, we just don't go to showdown. We just fold and we don't get to showdown, so there's no chance of winning. Basically, it's just like how many rounds can the button go back to where it was, for example, before you have no chips left. So yeah, that's what it is. So basically, the way to calculate this is you get your stack size, and you divide it by the number of you divide it by all of the dead money in antes. So antes plus small blind plus BB. In this case, our M would be calculated by the following. Let's have a look. So the big blind is 250, the small blind is 125, and the dead money in antes is 200, as you can see here. And this is something I'll just quickly mention now, just so you guys remember this. This is quite important in general. Like, it's not huge, but just remember this. The more players there are, the more dead money there are in antes. So if we're 3-handed, antes aren't as significant as they are when there's 9 players, because obviously an ante is something that each player plays, and if the ante is 50 and 9 people pay, that's 450, and if there's 3 players, then there's only 150 in dead money from the ante. So again, remember that, because once you get to the final table, or like final 2 tables or something, when you do get short-handed, antes become slightly less significant because, you know, of the reasons I just explained. So again, the dead money equates to 575, and our stack size is 4,840. So for simplicity, let's just say like it's 5,000 basically. Divided by 575. Now obviously you don't need to like calculate exactly in your mind like exactly what the number is, because it's going to be like a decimal almost always, but you know, you want to have an approximate idea. So in this case it's approximately 9. Yeah, and there's not much else to say. It's approximately 9. So our M is approximately 9. But it's more important to also consider like effective stack sizes. So if we have an M of 9, you know, Oliver's dad effectively does with us as well. But if you look at, say, for example, the big blind, he's only got like an M of, let's say, so he's got what, 2,250, like 2,300 or so. Yeah, so he's got an M of 4. So obviously, you know, with any particular M, we're gonna have a range, right? But it's going to be different depending on, you know, our opponent's effective stack sizes. So if we had like 5,000 chips here and everyone behind had 3,000, then obviously we should be shoving the range that we would shove if we had 3,000 ourselves. Similarly, like obviously, like with any particular range you have, it's gonna not be perfect, because it's almost never gonna be true that everyone has the same stack size. So if you know that as in general you shove like, say, on the cutoff with an M of 5, you know, say 70%, right? Then if suddenly you had like an M of 6, obviously you can, you know, shove a little bit tighter. But instead, let's say you have an M of 5 and everyone else does as well behind you, except for the button who has an M of 3. You can shove like a tiny bit wider now because he's shorter with you. Yeah, so basically, yeah, you do need to consider like the stack sizes behind you and the effective stack sizes. And one of the ways to do this is like if you have a particular range, and this is something that you guys will hopefully be able to find. But for example, there's like there's equilibrium charts, you know, available around the web and stuff like that, and also in Kill Everyone. And if you look at that chart, it'll give you like a range for every particular M. In every particular position, and if you have different stack sizes, obviously you can't follow this perfectly, because you know, if it says shove under the gun with an M of 8 with this range, you know, that's almost never going to be the case. You're never going to be under the gun with 8M with everyone. What you can do, there's 2 things you can do. Like it depends on the stack sizes, but one of the first things you can do is you can raise with the intention of calling a shove from everyone except for, you know, the deepest players, and that obviously depends on your hand and the players and so on. But that's one example, and the second example is, which is more common, and I usually do this because I play so many tables, so it becomes easier. And again, whilst it may not be the best play, like it might be slightly worse than raise calling in some situations, it's the best play for me, because if I were to you know, raise and didn't have to reevaluate, it's gonna make it tougher for me to make more decisions later. So in this particular situation, so not this particular hand, sorry, but you know, in that particular situation, what you can do is you can kind of average the M out. So if you see like you have let's say ace 10 offsuit under the gun, you normally wouldn't shove in a particular situation, right? With your current stack size. If like 3 people behind are kind of short, you can kind of average the M, and now, you know, you can say, oh, because these 3 players are shorter, even though I'm a little bit deeper than I normally would be when I want to shove off ace 10, I can shove now. So again, you can kind of average it out, and again, you know, you can kind of find these charts around the web and stuff. But you know, again, feel free to ask, and I'll try to post one in the in this video's thread shortly after this video, you know, for those who are interested. And of course, I always give it to my students when I'm coaching as well. So yep, these are pretty standard folds, obviously. Here again, blind versus blind. Oh, okay, so this is something that's really important. Blind versus blind. Once there are antes, your range can obviously, like before I said, as a default you should shove 10 any 2 cards blind versus blind with 10 big blinds versus non-regulars and players who aren't too, you know, loose. For obvious reasons. Now, instead, let's say instead, you know, there are antes now. I'm gonna quickly show you on Slingo Wizard like exactly what it looks like. But with antes, you can shove something like I believe like around 15 big blinds or so, versus most randoms. Because again, like I said, whilst they should be, and you know, you guys should be obviously, but whilst they should be, they don't adjust to the antes. So if you shove 10 big blinds pre-ante and they call 20%. once there are antes, they still call 20%. They don't call wider. They should be calling wider because there's more dead money and it gives them better pot odds, but they don't. So therefore, we can shove a much wider range. And I'll just give you an example. Sorry, this might take a second, but anyway, yeah, I'll show you. So let's just say quickly, it doesn't really matter which one I choose, but 180 man, blinds are like any particular level really. It doesn't matter what the other guys have, as long as they have the antes, because we're not gonna consider ICM. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter what they have as long as they cover the antes. So sorry. Okay, so we have around basically 4,400 effective. Actually, no. Let's talk about exactly 15 big blinds. Okay, so So let's say 15 big blinds. We have 3-2 offsuit, and I am aware that 3-2 offsuit actually has slightly better equity than maybe like say 7-2. I think like versus a tight calling range, but it's a bit simpler, and I'll just quickly show you guys. So now, firstly, we'll put chip, like this is something that you guys can see, like JJYYKK's sit and go wizard short. It's pretty good, and it'll show you stuff like this. Like just make sure you leave out ICM tax and stuff, because it's not going to be relevant until the final table, and for these calculations you should just ignore it. Well, ignore it for like looking at your range anyway. If we click on this, we can see that in order for this to be not profitable, he has to call 28% or more. Like obviously, because we have an edge, we should basically put a little bit of tax, and that's why there was like originally like a chip edge, right? But I put 0 to see what I can shove profitably in the absolute sense, right? So if we do have an edge, obviously, if it says that we should shove if he's calling 28% or less, we should shove if he's calling like say 26% or less because of an edge. But in any case, he's like the average random player is not going to be calling 25% or more or something like that. So it's definitely profitable to shove any two cards there. 15 big blinds or less, blind versus again non-regulars and non-loose players. And again, if we look at our hand, it's Jack 4 offsuit, right? It's not a good hand, but it's much better than, well, it's significantly better than 3-2. Now, oops, actually, I'll show you what 3-2 said. So 3-2 was profitable by one whole, like more than one big blind. That's pretty massive. Now, oops, oh sorry, no, that's not right. That's versus that range. Let's say he's calling 20%, which is fairly standard. Like it's profitable by like half a big blind, right? With 3-2 offsuit, which is still pretty significant, and we should definitely do it. Like for example, if we were calling like say 25%, it's gonna be profitable by like so little that we should probably just fold because of our edge. But if we have like instead versus the same range of 25%, as you can see, this is like very very slightly profitable. But if we have like Jack 4, it becomes a bit more profitable because our hand obviously has better equity. So again, you can see it's now half a big blind instead of 1/3. So again, even if our hand is slightly better than 3-2 offsuit or something, it becomes significantly favored towards a shove. So yeah, I mean that's why I shoved here, because he's a random, and as you saw earlier, he limp folded and did crap like that. So it's pretty easy to shove here. And that being said, there's actually something that I want to mention now. Whilst shoving is profitable, versus many players, especially extremely passive ones, it's actually better to limp and bet any flop. And the reason for that is just because they'll only raise if they have a good hand, and they're not gonna like play back at you. So if he has like I don't know, 7, well, basically any two cards, he's almost never gonna raise you unless he's got a good hand. And again, this is versus passive players, and you do want to look at their stats when you do make this decision. But the reason for this is basically because, like, if you shove, and they fold, you win, the big blind, the small blind, and the ante. So basically, the dead money, right? Now, if you limp, and then you bet the flop, and they fold, you win the same thing. Now, at the same time, you're risking less. Like, when you shove and they call, you're going to be losing, depending on your hand, a significant amount of chips and equity, right? But instead, in this case, if you limp and then you bet the flop, you only lose your limp and your your bet if they do happen to pick up a hand. And again, they're not going to play back if they're passive, so that's something you can consider. So like, well, depends on the stack size obviously, but like say for example with 10 big blinds and there are antes, you should just shove, like, full stop. But if it's 15 big blinds, for example, whilst shoving is profitable, with any two cards versus most people, sometimes limping with the intention of betting any flop is more profitable, and usually you can just bet like, one half of the pot or maybe 2/3 or so. At the same time, you can also like, min raise or raise very small, like, for example, in this particular hand, you can raise like 650 or something like that, and they'll fold very often. It's the same thing, and sometimes this is better, and the reason for this is because they're going to defend, sorry, they're not gonna play back and stuff. So therefore, you know, if they do fold their crappy hands, it's good for you. Whereas, you know, if they have like any two cards, right, if you limp, they're gonna get to see the flop. So if he's got 7-3 offsuit, he's gonna fold to a raise, like no matter how small it is, unless he's really really loose. But instead, if you limped, and you know he can still flop top here and stuff like that. So basically, it's just if you fold, sorry, if you raise any amount, you're gonna get a bit more fold equity. And again, versus certain players, it's better to raise small or to limp and bet any flop rather than just a shove. And I'll just give you actually something that just came to mind. I'll just show you, like, this was with 15 big blinds, but let's say we have 10 big blinds in your antes, like, and again, there's no edge and stuff, so you guys will need to consider this, but like, let's just look at how massively profitable it is, like, to shove. Like, if he's calling, he needs to be calling like 46% or more for it to be not profitable. And like, you know, show me a random that does that. Like, 46% looks like this. Obviously, you know, Sit-n-Go Wizards, you know, range, like, when it goes like this, it's not exactly perfect. Like, sometimes, you know, in this case, some people call twos, you know, before they call, for example, maybe King 6 suited, depending on the play, obviously, but don't worry about that. Sorry. So, again, 46% looks like this. I mean, like, when was the last time you guys saw a random call of King 2 offsuit or like King 7 offsuit? Like, unless they have really really loose stats, they're not doing that. Like, these are mathematically correct calls versus like a wide shoving range, but you know the randoms aren't doing it. So yeah, it's, and as you can see, if he's calling, you know, even 25%, which is wider than most randoms will be calling. Like, I mean, randoms generally just on average aren't calling like King 10 offsuit and stuff like that, even though they should be. And as you can see, hang on a second. Yeah, okay. With 20%, it's gonna be profitable by one big blind with this hand. But like, if he's calling like 20%, for example, you know, it just, you know, becomes more. Hang on, something's not right. Sorry, one second. No, actually, no, that is right. But yeah, I mean, it's, you know, pretty significantly profitable in any case. Um, and yeah, I'm sorry, that was just like a side note that I thought I should mention. That didn't, like, that kind of sounded fair. Anyway, yeah, okay. So this is a pretty easy fold, obviously. So I noticed that this is going quite long, so I'm just gonna like go through a few more hands, and then I'll finish this hand history in the next episode. So here, this is a spot where quite a lot of regulars, or maybe a few regulars anyway, would shove. I decided to fold. Sometimes I would shove here too, especially if the blinds were about to go up, and yeah, but in this particular situation, I decided to fold. I would say like Ace 9 offsuit, for example, is a definite shove. Ace 8 is kind of close, and Ace 7, you know, again, is basically marginal as well, and you can probably shove it fine. So you can probably shove it and it would be fine, but you know, I did fold. Oopsie, 3-2. So here, you know, limp pot, definitely just check. I would shove like any pocket pair, probably like any Broadway, because there's antes, so there's more dead money now. And again, we've seen that this guy's limp and folded like, you know, 2 times or something already, and he's obviously a recreational player who's just not gonna call wide. So I would shove like any Broadway, and like and yeah, and the small blinds range is gonna be extremely weighted towards like really weak hands. Like, sometimes people do limp monsters, but as a general rule, if a second player limps behind, it's almost never a monster, because there's already someone in the pot, and they just, you know, they're just too scared they're gonna get outflopped or whatever. So if someone limps, it can be aces and kings or whatever. But if a second guy limps, it's almost never aces and kings. So and especially if this is regular, he's always gonna shove like or raise the top of his range. So once he limps, he's, you know, basically defined his hand as maybe some sort of pseudo connector, or maybe some kind of marginal Broadway or something like that. So in any case, I would shove like any Broadway here, and like pseudo connectors down to like 8-9 suited, and like any pocket pair, and probably even any ace, including offsuit. So yeah, this is obvious check, and on this board, you know, just check, fold, and give up. Like, if it was a really dry board like 10-10-4, 10-4, 10-4-4, King 7-2 or something like that, sometimes I might bet it. But you know, in this case I don't. Oh, and this is just a general thing that came to mind right now, but if it's a dry board that's like, you know, King XX, it's usually going to be better to take to take a stab than Ace XX if they're limpers, because fish like to limp Ace X hands, but they don't really limp as many King X hands. So that's just a general thing to keep in mind. Here, you know, it's an easy fold once this happens. But yep. Again, easy fold now. Here, pretty easy fold regardless. Fold. Here, pretty clear shove. I don't know why I didn't. It's definitely a shove here. Like we're so short, and you know, we're near the we're nearly hit by the big blind and stuff, so we're gonna lose a lot of fold equity, and this is definitely a shove. And actually, it's a good point. It's a good point to mention that, actually, just because I think that on average a lot of you may be not doing that. So yeah, I mean, like a spot like this, when you're this short, you should definitely be shoving once there are antes. So yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna yeah, end the video at that, because it's already been like 70 minutes or something like that. And yeah, if you guys have any questions at all, just you know, let me know. And yeah, I'll finish this hand history in the next episode. And yeah, actually, what I'm gonna do is, like, I do need someone for like a hand history review for like a latest episode. So the first person to PM me will get like a free hand history review. So yeah, go ahead and do that. And this is OMG Cladle for Deuces Crack. Thanks for watching.